Hey, good morning. Hope you're all doing well. A little different format this morning. Doing this, it's not Facebook Live this morning, but doing it this way. Our lesson today. We're going to be in Proverbs chapter 14, verses 8 through 15. The title of today's lesson is Living Wisely. Before we get started, I want to kind of just sort of set the scene here a little bit and get you to think about something, maybe a recipe. And if you wanted to make something, I was one time wanting to make my own salsa. And so I had this recipe, and as I go through, and I was very careful to make sure that I added the exact ingredients that it called for and put it in, put them in this order, and that I did it exactly the way it was supposed to be in order to get to the salsa at the end. Now, if along the way, if I would have said, well, I know it calls for, adding tomatoes, but I think I'll put cantaloupe in here instead. I think that's a better decision. I'm going to end up with something way different than the directions had me going for. And so something similar to that is also true when it comes to God's wisdom. And Solomon here is still directing his son about the great importance and need of seeking out God's wisdom, but not only seeking it out, but following it in his life as well. He's going to take and contrast God's wisdom to the life that foolish people have. And he's taken these, now as we go through this lesson is a little different today. There's a literary style here that's used, and it's called, and I'm probably not going to say this name right, but chiasmus. Is this literary style, and it's a little bit different way of writing. This idea or this style of writing here, it arranges the main idea in the center of the passage instead of like at the beginning or the end. And so when this lesson was designed here, and the designer of our lesson, he took and rearranged these passages here just a little bit for the purpose of bringing these ideas together in a continuous theme. So I'll keep you straight of where I'm reading from, but we are going to be in Proverbs chapter 14. Starting with verse 9, but we're not going to read in chronological order. We're going to be moving the order around, and what I mean by that is we're going to take, if we look at verses 8 through 15, we're going to look at 8 and 15, then we'll go 9 and 14, and then we'll go 10 and 13, and then 11 and 12. And I'll keep reminding you of that, but it keeps the idea constant as we go through there. And Solomon's wanting his son to really understand this, and it's good advice to us as well, that a life of godly wisdom and the results of, you're going to have to see the contrast here between a life of godly wisdom and living foolishly without God's wisdom. And so that's where we're going to be going today, and I'll try to remind you of the order I'm reading these verses. So let's start off with verse 8. Verse 8, and here again, this is Proverbs 14, starting in verse 8. It says in verse 8, "The wisdom of the prudent is to understand his way, but the folly of fools is deceit." So in verse 8 here, in this verse of the chasm, and here again, I hope I'm saying that word correctly here, it sheds the light on applying God's wisdom and being prudent. Now, prudent involves, thinking through a situation very carefully before drawing a conclusion or coming up with some sort of a decision. When we take the time to seek the Lord's direction, and I think about a lot of times in my life, and I've made decisions, and I've looked back and thought, oh gosh, I made that quick decision without consulting with the Lord with it, and there's been many times that I've thought, good, great, how did I mess this up? Well, I didn't follow the directions. I didn't seek God's wisdom in this. I didn't take the time. I felt like it was something I had to rush. I had to do it right then, and this, instead of saying, all right, God, what do you want me to do? How do I need to handle this? I need your wisdom in handling this situation. So we want to make sure that we're doing that we take the time to seek the Lord's direction as we face every situation, and we can then reflect this, and then we're able to use this godly wisdom. And given this due consideration to all the variables involved and such, and seeking God's will is what a mature Christian does. So as we're going through that's what Solomon's telling his son here. Now Solomon also in this part here, he set the wisdom of a sensible person or a person following good godly advice in stark contrast to fools. And as he says here, it says the wisdom of the prudent is to understand his way, but the folly of fools is deceit. So he's contrasting the two here, that foolish people don't take the time to think through the situation facing them. Instead, they make these quick decisions and they dive headlong into this before seeking and trying to find out what is God's will, what is God's wishes that I do in this, what is the direction that the Lord wants to lead me here. And before long, the folly or the foolishness of their actions becomes very important. God's wisdom encourages and urges us to take the long look and seek Him and seek His direction in these situations. Let's go now. Remember I said we're not going to read in chronological order. We're doing reading 8 through 15, but we're going to go 8 with 15 together, 9 with 14, 10 with 13, 11 with 12. So anyway, that was 8. Let's go to verse 15. If you're following along in your Bible, skip to verse 15. It says, "The simple believeth every word, but the prudent man looketh well to his going." So in verse 15 here, foolish people tend to be simple when it comes to handling life's challenges and opportunities as well. They haven't yet learned the necessity of nourishing a relationship with the Lord in which love for Him moves us to respect Him and to seek His wisdom. They're inexperienced. The foolish person here, they're inexperienced with handling life with God's wisdom. When they're not doing that, it can prompt them to believe on every word they hear. If they hear a little bit of so-called wisdom or somebody that seems like they know what they're talking about, they're liable to jump onto that and embrace it before seeking what God's will is for them. And sooner or later, they come to see that what they embraced didn't turn out to be very wise at all. Prudent Christians take an altogether different approach. Whole different approach with this. Instead of just acting and depending on what I have experienced or my things that I like or the things that I see as important, prudent Christians take a different approach. We walk with the Lord because we love Him, and we're certain and we know that He will provide us with wisdom in what to do if we will seek that out. So here again, verse 8 goes along with verse 15. If we now go to verse 9, so jump back up to verse 9. Verse 9 says, "Fools make a mock at sin, but among the righteous there is favor." So this comparison between people who turn out to be fools and God's people who live out His wisdom continues here in the law of restitution. For God's people in Solomon's day, if you did something against someone or you committed some type of a sin, that you would make restitution for that. And God's people during this time, they were embracing this, and they had been instructed to see this as something holy, this making restitution for something that had been done. Solomon said, it says in here that the fools wouldn't take the law of restitution very seriously. They didn't think anyone would make them be accountable for their actions, or even God for that matter. They would mock the law. God's people knew that His wisdom and the way that they wanted that we were to respond to sin was different. and that we, the godly people, would strive to be righteous. And they took this law of restitution very seriously, and as a result of that, and following God's direction and His wisdom in this, in God's guidance, that they understood the necessity of this wholesome relationship of making things right. That if you had wronged someone, you made restitution for that. And as a result of this, their relationships would be marked by favor, and they end up with this willingness to make amends and reconciliation. So here again, sort of the contrast here, that the fools saw this as something useless that they're not going to be held accountable for, and the godly person here is going to follow God's his wisdom, His direction in this, and take this very seriously and see it as something that truly needs to be done. And because of this, their relationships are going to be marked by favor. Now, so we looked at 8 and 15, so now we're looking at 9 and 14. So let's skip to number 14, verse 14. It says, "The backslider in heart shall be filled with his own ways, and a good man shall be satisfied from himself." From himself. Sorry, I'm having trouble reading that. The Hebrew term of backslider paints a picture of a person who has taken steps in one particular direction and then decides to turn back. We hear that in religion a lot, or the term backslider. The English word suggests someone who has kind of started off maybe as a loyal follower of the Lord, but then turns around and loses heart and retreats and changes and goes back to the lifestyle or the inclinations that they had before. According to this verse here, they will be held accountable for their disloyalty. The day will come when they can expect to receive full payment for their conduct. The good man can expect a different outcome. Their walk with Him, their walk with the Lord, produces goodness in them that shows in their actions. Across time, their loyalty to God turns out to be a blessing to themselves as well as to others. Instead of paying the wages of disloyalty, they can count on being rewarded. So you have these here again, these contrasts between the godly man and the fool, or the godly person and the fool. So let's go to verse 10. So this was 14, that was 9 and 14. So now we're going to 10 and 13. So verse 10, "The heart knoweth his own bitterness, and a stranger doeth not intermeddle with his joy." A person's heart stores a wide range of emotions, and some of which remain shrouded from the view of others. In a way, intimate relationships grow when we share our hearts with someone else, but our hearts can also can't really ever reveal truly everything that is there. You will have, for instance, we share our pain with others, but we can't actually internalize the true depth sometimes of that, or the true depth of bitterness that may be locked away in someone's heart. Another example has to do with joy. Now, joy and happiness are not the same thing. Those two get used interchangeably a lot, but they're not the same thing. Our happiness depends on our circumstances. Joy has nothing to do with our circumstances. Joy doesn't fade when conditions change. Now, I can be real happy and real excited out on the lake, just very, very happy out on the lake fishing, and all of a sudden a bad thunderstorm comes up. Well, I'm no longer happy because my situation or my circumstances changed there. Joy is not that way. As we walk in the Lord, we enjoy His presence and rejoice with His grace no matter what is happening in our lives, that we have this joy. The joy doesn't change based on our circumstances. Someone who doesn't have a relationship with God, they can't understand our joy. They don't understand where this is coming from. A person who has, and it says in here, they shall not, a good man shall be satisfied. Sorry, I just went to the wrong verse. In verse 10 here, it says, and a stranger doeth. A person who has not received Christ stands as a stranger and simply has to behold our joy from a distance. So let's go to verse 13 now. Let's get into verse 13. Verse 13, even in laughter, the heart is sorrowful, and the end of that mirth is heaviness. So we usually consider laughter to be evidence of happiness. However, laughter can a lot of times be hiding other things, and they can conceal a heart maybe that's drowning in sorrow. People sometimes turn to laughter in an effort to numb pain and sorrow. I think about the comedian Robin Williams, in his life, and sort of a comedic genius there, but a lot of his comedy and the laughing part was hiding some other things. For people who suffer with sadness, a smile may hide a lot more than it actually reveals. A heart full of joy comes from an intimate relationship with God. Believers don't need to develop some type of a ruse or a blanket to cover up sorrow. Instead, we can count on the joy that comes from our walk with the Lord to sustain us, even when our hearts are aching. And we're going to have these times. Things are going to happen and situations are going to occur. Grief awaits us all, but our joy holds us up and helps us endure it. And so that's what he's saying here in this verse, verse 13. Let's go to verse 11 now. Verse 11, it says, the house of the wicked shall be overthrown, but the tabernacle of the upright shall flourish. A wicked person has rejected the Lord and refused to walk in His wisdom. Now, spiritually speaking, wicked people have built a house on a foundation of personal thoughts, preferences, prejudices, philosophies. That kind of foundation can't withstand the challenges that are going to come with life. Because of the flimsy foundation that they're built on, the house will eventually be overthrown and be completely demolished. Now, that's the outcome that is awaiting anyone who decides to ignore God's wisdom. And in this verse here, Solomon compares the shift is from that to a tabernacle. Sorry, I'm having trouble with words this morning, or tent. Now, a tent is a secure place when it's the home of an upright person. Being upright means that we are right with God, and we're showing it in our relationships with others. When we determine that we are and set out that we're going to follow God's wisdom, we can count on Him. We have the assurance that He will help us and we will flourish. That's the outcome for God's people who choose to be wise in the Lord. Let's go to verse 12 now. It says, there is a way which seemeth right unto a man, but the end thereof are the ways of death. Each person chooses a path for his or her life. Each one of us has to make that choice. Some people will depend on their own ingenuity to guide them as they choose which way they seem to think. It says here, there is a way which seemeth right. So they will depend on their own selves to guide them in what they think's right. But here again, their opinions, their decisions are going to be based on their opinions, their values, ambitions, prejudices, or the way they see things. They set out on a path that seems right to them. Without God, people do not have the wisdom to make the best choices in their lives. You know, I a lot of times think with my life, if I would have known how this was going to be, I would have done this or done this. And I think too, when we go to someone for advice or direction, that person doesn't know really the end of how this is going to turn out. How awesome is it that we can go to God, and he already knows how this is going to play out. We can seek his wisdom. He sees so much more of it and so much of what's going on, and we end up being where we need to be. Not always necessarily where we think we should be, but we end up where we need to be. The foolish man, they only have their own impressions to lean on as they live out their days. They live in the hope that, hey, I hope this turns out right, or I hope this was the right decision. But they live in hope in a path and following a path that they've chosen. They're hoping, oh, I hope this brings me fulfillment. I hope this gets me to where I'm supposed to be. But in the end, they don't thrive. Instead, they find that they discover that their sorrow, that the path they've chosen for themselves, and this sorrow is that it leads to death. Taking a path that would lead us to joy requires us to decide we want to be wise in the Lord. We want to follow the Lord's direction in our lives, and we have to actively seek that out. Where do we find it? We find it in His Word. Now, I know today's lesson with jumping between one verse to the next and going from 8 to 15, then 9 to 14 somewhat may have been a little bit confusing. Here again, it was just a literary style that was used there, but we changed the order here again to do this so that we had a continuous theme here. The big thing is with this is good advice. This is excellent advice. Let's not be guilty of not following it. Now, Solomon is directing his son and telling his son these things, but they also apply there in our lives as well. And I know we've all done this. We've ended up in situations and thinking, God, I'm not sure how I got here, and I'm not sure exactly how this turned to be such a big mess. This wasn't what I intended. This wasn't necessarily the recipe I was following, but we'll find a lot of times instead of seeking God's will, that we ended up substituting something else in there, our own preferences and this type of thing. So as we go through our lives, it's so important that we seek out God's will and follow His direction in all that we do. I look forward to seeing you next week. Have a great rest of your day. Don't forget Brother Aaron to be on at 11 o'clock. He's going to do an awesome job bringing you the message that the Lord has laid on his heart. Look forward to seeing you soon. Take care. Bye-bye.